The world is now split up into a host of different nations, all with very clearly defined boundaries. The American continent is no exception. It's divided up into neat parcels labeled Canada and United States, Mexico, and so on. We take this for granted, but when you think that the history of the Americas goes back over 10,000 years, these borders were only put there yesterday. The frontier that separates Canada from the US, for instance, only began to be drawn in 1783, after the United States became independent. Before that, Canada and the US, as we know them, didn't exist in political terms. Same applies to the Latin American countries. In fact, for thousands of years before the coming of the Europeans, the native peoples had lived here without any political boundaries at all. That wasn't how this continent was divided up. Let's see how it was divided.
Even today, you can still get an idea of what the American continent was like when man first came here. There's just about every sort of natural environment you can think of. In Canada alone, there are forests and grasslands, mountains and lakes, and sandy beaches. The weather can be very wet or very dry. It can be blisteringly hot or icy cold. Some areas are teeming with wildlife. Other areas are almost completely deserted. But none of these different climates and environments stop at the US border. The Arctic region that stretches across the top of Canada overlaps into Alaska. The huge expanse of subarctic tundra, which covers much of the rest of the country, also spills over into Alaska. The eastern woodlands and Great Lakes region are shared by both Canada and the United States. The Great Plains include both the Canadian and the American prairies. The damp coastal regions of British Columbia also stretch down as far as California. The high plateau region of BC includes parts of the northwestern United States. In fact, all of the Americas are split up into a patchwork of strikingly different geographical regions, which bear almost no relation at all to the present-day political divisions of the continent. So the native peoples who lived on this continent for thousands of years before the coming of the Europeans were not Canadians, or Americans, or Brazilians. Such political definitions didn't exist. Instead, they were defined by whichever ecological region they inhabited. The Indians of what is now southeastern Canada and the northeastern United States were the Woodland peoples. Those who lived in what are now the Canadian and American prairies were the people of the plains. The Indians who lived on the shores of the Pacific, from British Columbia to northern California, were the peoples of the Northwest Coast. All of North and South America was divided in this way into a mosaic of different geographical regions. Since the native peoples were the first human beings on this continent, there was no man here before them to claim possession of the land, so they were free to roam wherever they wished. The only thing stopping them going from one region to another was the ability to survive in each new environment. That was the only passport they needed.
Modern Canada was founded by two nations, France and England, as reflected in our two official languages, reflétés par nos deux langues officielles. But for thousands of years before the French and the English came on the scene, Canada was divided among the different native peoples who inhabited the various geographical regions, the First Nations of Canada. So far, we've only talked about the Indians, but there's another First Nation we haven't looked at yet, the Eskimos, or Inuit. Let's see how they fit into the picture and where they come from.
Like the traditions of the Indians, Eskimo traditions also maintain that they have always been here. But scientists believe they too originally came from Asia, across the same Bering Strait that brought the Indians here. When the first peoples arrived in the Americas from Asia about 25,000 years ago, the Ice Age had turned the Bering Strait into a land bridge, joining the two continents together. But by about 10,000 years ago, the Ice Age was coming to an end, and the process which had formed the land bridge reversed itself. The glaciers melted, and the water ran back into the ocean, flooding the Bering Strait, and cutting off North America from Asia. From now on, any Asian hunters who wanted to come here would either have to do it by boat or wait until the Bering Strait froze over in the winter so that they could walk across the ice. It is possible that other waves of Asians did just that, eventually moving into various regions of North America. But for a long period, there was one region which remained empty, the Arctic itself. This was, in fact, the last major region of unoccupied land on Earth. Not surprisingly, since this is such a harsh and forbidding environment. It wasn't until about 2000 BC that for some unknown reason, another group of Asian hunters decided to brave the elements and to settle in the Arctic. We can get some idea of what they were like from these present-day Netsilik Eskimos. Although the first wave of hunters who moved into the Arctic were not the direct ancestors of the modern Eskimos. In fact, to distinguish between them, the original occupants of the Arctic are known as Old Eskimos or Paleo-Eskimos. The Paleo-Eskimos came from the same sort of Asiatic stock as the Indians. The main thing that set them apart from the Indians was the fact that they arrived in the Americas much later and confined themselves to the Arctic. Between roughly 2000 and 1000 BC, the Paleo-Eskimos spread all across the Arctic from Siberia to Alaska to Labrador and then on to Greenland, an enormous territory, nearly 8,000 kilometers wide. They remained the sole inhabitants of this huge region until about 900 AD, when they were replaced by yet another wave of Asiatic hunters, which spread across the Arctic from Alaska to Greenland. These are known as the Thule People. It is from the Thule that the present-day Canadian Eskimos are descended. The word Eskimo itself is an Indian word, which means foreigner. But Canadian Eskimos never use this term. They always refer to themselves as the Inuit. which means the people.
Thanks to modern science, we can now live almost completely independently of the elements. In the coldest Canadian winter, I can surround myself with tropical plants if I wish. Or, on the hottest summer's day, I can go ice skating. We're no longer at the mercy of our environment. But for most of the history of this country, the particular climate and terrain of the various regions where people lived affected almost everything they did. This is especially true of life here in pre-European times, when the native peoples lived very close to nature indeed. How did they live, in fact, during all those thousands of years before the Europeans started to settle here?
To find out what sort of life the native peoples led in pre-European times, we must start with what they were doing when they first arrived in the Americas. They were big game hunters. Their chief sources of food were the mammoths, mastodons, and giant bison, which they had followed here from Asia across the Bering Strait land bridge, and which had grown to such an enormous size as a response to the frigid conditions of the Ice Age. But just as the Indians began to spread out across the Americas about 10,000 years ago, the Ice Age was coming to an end. And as the climate warmed up and the landscape changed accordingly, it became more and more difficult for the mammoths and other very large animals to survive. At the same time, the Indians were becoming more and more efficient at hunting their prey. The result of all this was that within about 1,000 years of the first settling of the Americas, many of the large Ice Age animals had become extinct. The mammoths and the mastodons and the giant bison vanished altogether. Other animals disappeared too. When the Indians first came here, they also used to hunt wild camels and horses for food. Both the camel and the horse actually originated in the New World and only later spread to the Old World across the same land bridge that had brought the Indians here. But by about 7,000 BC, the Indians had hunted the original American horses and camels so successfully that they too had died out. So now the Indians had to devise other ways of finding food. They had to adjust their way of life to the particular region they inhabited. In the forests of what is now eastern Canada and the States, they hunted a variety of game. They learned to make the utmost of whatever animal they came across. They wasted nothing. Its meat was their food. Its skin, their clothing and shelter. Its bones became their tools. Its sinews, their threads. They also foraged for many different sorts of wild plants and roots. One of the mainstays of their existence in the woodland region was the birch tree. They used its wood to make snowshoes and toboggans. From birch bark, they fashioned canoes, wigwams, cooking pots. On the northwest coast, salmon provided the bulk of the Indians' diet. They also put the giant cedars of this region to numerous uses: totem poles, houses, canoes. In the Arctic, For much of the year, survival of the Inuit depended almost exclusively on the seal. They ate its meat, used seal oil as fuel, made their clothes out of seal skin. They even learned to use the Arctic snow itself as the building material of their houses or igloos. On the prairies, the Indians stalked the buffalo, the last echo of their original big game hunting tradition. In some cases, as here in southern Alberta, at a place which is still known as head-smashed-in buffalo jump, they kept up the Ice Age practice of stampeding large numbers of animals over cliffs. The reliance of the Plains Indians on the buffalo was almost total. Buffalo meat made up virtually their entire diet. Their clothes and their teepees were made from buffalo hide. Even the buffalo's stomach was used as a cooking pot. The early history of the native peoples of this land is essentially the story of how they progressively fine-tuned their way of life to their environment. And since there were so many different environments in the territory that was to become Canada, how people lived varied as widely as the land itself.
From being a fairly uniform group of Asian hunters when they first came to the New World, the native peoples gradually developed into a whole range of different cultural groups as they adapted to the different environments on this continent. But in spite of their diversity on a physical level, most of the first inhabitants of Canada and the rest of the Americas had a lot in common on a spiritual level. They nearly all shared an attitude towards nature that was very different from the approach to life that has developed in the Western world. For example, I can switch all this on or off at will. I can manipulate the temperature, the light, the humidity. I control my environment. I dominate it, in a sense. This isn't at all how the native people have traditionally interacted with the natural world. What sort of attitude towards nature did they develop?
To understand the native people's relationship to nature, we have to try to put ourselves in their place. If you live very close to nature for thousands of years, you learn to identify with it to an extraordinary extent. You learn to move in the woods as if they were an extension of your own body. You grow very close to the animals that you hunt. You learn how to imitate the sounds they make. You may give yourself an animal name, as these famous Indians did. Sitting Bull, Medicine Crow, Bear Bull, Bear's Belly. You may even get inside the skins of certain animals, either to help you hunt them or for religious purposes. In fact, this identification with animals and plants and every part of the natural world is at the heart of almost all native religions in the Americas. On the surface, these may seem very diverse, but one belief is held almost universally. All living things, plants as well as animals, have souls. Just as biologists now agree that all living things are physically related, so the Indians and the Inuit believed, and continue to believe today, that they are all spiritually related. This means that the idea of give and take is the essence of their lives. If you go hunting for a bear, for example, it isn't you who are taking its life. It is the bear which is giving you its life. In return, you make an offering or say a prayer to the dead animal. You do this in order to please its soul, so it will tell the souls of its fellow bears of your kindness, so that they in turn will one day offer themselves to you. Everything is interrelated, so that there can be no thought of man as a superior being, since he depends for his very existence on his brothers of the earth, the sky and water. All things have an equally important role to play in maintaining nature's delicate balance. As far as we can tell, these ideas were already well established throughout Canada and the rest of the Americas by at least 1,000 years before the birth of Christ. The concept of nature as a web of life, with man, an equal partner with the animals and the plants, the sun and the wind and the rain. This view of the world contrasts sharply with the biblical perception of nature, which was to shape the approach to life of the entire Western world. In this view, nature is seen as a sort of pyramid, with man at the top, dominating everything else. Man was special, because according to the Old Testament, God created man in his own image, and ordered him to subdue the earth, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and the fowl of the air, and every living thing that moveth upon the earth. It would be difficult to imagine a sentiment more alien to the native peoples of this continent, a more complete parting of the ways.
The sign language that many hearing impaired people use today is based on the same principles as the sign language that was used for thousands of years by the Plains Indians of the Canadian and American prairies. In fact, most of the native peoples on this continent developed some system of visual signs, not only to communicate with the Europeans when they arrived, but also to communicate with each other. The deaf obviously need a sign language. But why should the native peoples have needed to communicate with signs? What sort of languages did they speak anyway? What were the first languages of Canada?
In some ways, the easiest of Canada's first languages to come to grips with is Inuktitut, the language of the Inuit. Because it is the language of all the Eskimo peoples, from Siberia and Alaska in the west, all across the Canadian Arctic, to Greenland in the east. It is also the only native language in the Americas which has close links with some of the languages of Asia. But the picture is a lot more complicated when we come to the Indians. Because there is no such thing as the Indian language. Over the thousands of years that they have been living here, the Indians have developed a tremendous variety of languages, which reflect the different cultural regions into which the Americas are divided. All of these languages seem to have evolved since the Indians came to the New World, for they bear no resemblance to any known Old World language.
Sigafkal, Pusagafkal, Pubalakal, Pupiukutakal, Pupium Kukoma, Pampiunatihtawa.
Within Canada alone, there are over 50 different Indian languages belonging to 10 language families. Before the coming of the Europeans, the linguistic regions of Canada corresponded fairly closely to the geographical regions. In the Arctic, Inuktitut was the dominant language. The subarctic was split between the Algonquian and the Athabascan languages. These children from the Northwest Territories are having a lesson in one of the Athabascan languages.
Setsa.
Setsa.
Seko.
Seko.
Seke.
These Micmac Indians from Nova Scotia are speaking an Algonquian language.
Hey, accordion. Wow.
Algonquian overlapped into the Prairies, where the other main language family was Siouan. In the St. Lawrence River Valley and southern Ontario, the Iroquoian languages were the most widespread. Here is an example of Iroquoian.
Sawatis, Sawatis, Luayat, Luayat, Gidaksa.
In the Plateau region, the Kootenay and Salish language families predominated. Salish also overlapped into the Northwest Coast region, which was the home of 4 other language families: Tlingit, Tsimshian, Haida, and Waukeshan. Over the Americas as a whole, there were more than 1,000 different Indian languages in pre-European times, some as unlike one another as English and Chinese. So for the First Nations of this continent to communicate with one another, they needed some sort of international language that they could all understand. Hence the sign language, which was developed on the Canadian and American prairies, which were a crossroads for many of the different Indian tribes.